There are some losses that never stop hurting, no matter how many years pass. For Rae Lindstrom, that loss was Scout, her German shepherd and closest companion. 12 years ago, they hiked into the Bitterroot Mountains together, but only Rae came back. Now 61 and retired from search and rescue work, she's returned to her old cabin to say goodbye before selling the land. But then she hears it, a bark cutting through the mountain silence. A grey-muzzled shepherd steps out from the trees. It's Scout, alive after all these years. The reunion should bring peace, but instead it opens up a mystery Rae never saw coming. Where has Scout been, and why did he disappear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up to the Bitterroot Mountains had taken Rae Lindstrom most of the day, and she'd stopped 3 times along the way, not because she needed to, but because she wasn't sure she wanted to arrive. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled in the gravel turnoff, and through the windshield she could see the narrow dirt road that led up to the cabin. 12 years. It had been 12 years since she'd last made this drive, and back then Scout had been sitting in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. Now the seat was empty. Rae pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and took a slow breath. She was 61 years old, and she'd spent 30 of those years as a search and rescue ranger in these mountains. She'd found lost hikers, confused elderly wanderers, kids who'd strayed too far from camp. She'd brought people home to their families, delivered them from the wilderness alive and grateful. But she hadn't been able to find her own dog. The guilt of that had never left her. She lifted her head and looked at the road again. The cabin sat 2 miles up, tucked into a stand of ponderosa pine with a view of the valley below. It had been her refuge for years, the place she'd come to between missions, where she could sit on the porch with Scout and listen to the wind move through the trees. She'd bought the land with her first real paycheck, back when she was 30, and thought she'd live up here forever. But after Scout disappeared, she couldn't bear to stay. Rae put the truck in gear and started up the road. The ruts were deeper than she remembered, and branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle as she climbed. When she finally pulled into the clearing, she sat for a moment, just looking at the cabin. The roof sagged in one corner, and the porch steps had rotted through in places. Ivy had claimed the north wall, and one of the shutters hung crooked on its hinges. It looked like a place where ghosts lived. She got out of the truck and stood in the clearing, listening. The forest was quiet, except for the wind and the distant call of a hawk. No barking, no scratch of claws on wood, no wet nose pressed against her palm. Rae walked up to the porch, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The door was still locked, the key still hidden under the same loose stone. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Dust covered the furniture like a shroud, and the air smelled of must and old wood. Her coffee cup still sat on the table, a ring of dried liquid at the bottom. Her jacket still hung on the hook by the door. She'd left in a hurry that day, driven by the need to get away from the place where she'd lost him. Rae set her bag down and walked through the cabin slowly, running her fingers along the backs of chairs, the edge of the mantel, the window sills. In the bedroom, Scout's dog bed still lay in the corner, his blanket folded neatly on top. She'd washed it the day before their last hike, and it still smelled faintly of detergent. On the dresser sat her old search and rescue badge, tarnished now but still recognizable. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. Rae Lindstrom, Senior Ranger, Bitterroot Search and Rescue. She'd worn it with pride for 3 decades, pinned to her jacket every time she headed into the field. She'd earned commendations, saved lives, trained younger rangers. She'd been good at her work, better than good, but none of that had mattered when Scout went missing. She set the badge down and walked back to the main room. Through the window, she could see the trail that led deeper into the mountains. That was the route they'd taken that last day, Scout ranging ahead of her the way he always did, nose to the ground, tail high. He'd been 7 years old then, in his prime, strong and healthy and happy. Rae had raised him from a puppy. She'd picked him out of a litter at a breeder's place in Missoula, a squirming ball of black and tan fur with oversized paws and ears that stood straight up. He'd slept on her chest that first night, and when he whimpered, she'd whispered to him that everything would be all right. She'd trained him herself, taught him tracking and search patterns, how to find people buried in snow or hidden in dense brush. He'd been a natural, smart and eager and tireless. They'd worked together for 6 years, and in that time, they'd found 43 people. 43 lives saved because of Scout's nose and Rae's experience. They'd been a team, perfectly matched, and she'd loved that dog more than she'd loved most people. The day he disappeared, they'd been on a recreational hike, not a mission. It was late September, and the aspens were turning gold. Rae had wanted to check on one of the old trails before winter set in, and Scout had been happy to come along. They'd been about 5 miles in when they'd heard the sound, a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rockslide. Rae had frozen, trying to determine which direction it was coming from, and then she'd seen the dust rising from the ridge above them. She'd shouted for Scout to come, but he'd been too far ahead, and the sound was too loud. She'd started running, trying to reach him, but the ground had shifted beneath her feet, and she'd gone down hard, her ankle twisting. By the time she'd gotten back up, the slide had stopped, and Scout was gone. She'd searched for 3 days, calling his name until her voice gave out, scrambling over fresh debris, checking every crevice and overhang. Other rangers had come to help, and they'd searched for another week after that. They'd found his tracks leading toward the slide area, but after that, the trail went cold. No body, no blood, no sign of him at all. He'd simply vanished. Rae had kept searching on her own for months after the official search ended. She'd hiked every trail within a 10-mile radius, left food and water at various locations, slept in the cabin, and listened for barking that never came. Eventually, her supervisor had suggested she take some time off, and when she'd come back, she'd requested a transfer to a different district. She couldn't work these mountains anymore, not when every ridge and valley reminded her of Scout. She'd finished out her career in the Flathead Range, 200 miles north. She'd done good work there, trained new rangers, saved more lives. But it had never felt the same. She'd never gotten another dog. Now, standing in the cabin with dust motes drifting through the afternoon light, Rae wondered why she'd come back. The realtor had said she could sell the property sight unseen, that there were plenty of people looking for remote land in Montana. But something had pulled her here, some need to see it one more time before letting it go. She walked back outside and sat on the porch steps, careful to avoid the rotted boards. The view was just as she remembered it. The valley spreading out below, the mountains rising in the distance, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. This was the view she'd imagined when she'd thought about retirement, back when she'd assumed Scout would be here with her, both of them growing old together in the place they loved. Instead, she'd spent the last 5 years in a small apartment in Kalispell, volunteering at the library, and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. The town of Timber Ridge sat at the base of the mountain, a collection of about 300 souls who made their living from logging, tourism, and stubbornness. Rae had known most of them, back when she'd lived up here. She'd bought her groceries at Mackay's general store, eaten breakfast at Gwen's cafe, shared beers with Lloyd Hutchins at the Timber Ridge Tavern. Lloyd was the county sheriff now, though back then he'd just been a deputy with a good heart and a tendency to worry too much. She wondered if he still lived in town, if he'd remember her. The sun was starting to sink toward the western peaks, and Rae stood up. She needed to unload the truck, get the generator running, figure out if the well still worked. She'd planned to stay for a week, long enough to sort through her belongings and decide what to keep, what to donate, what to leave for whoever bought the place. She turned toward the truck, and that's when she heard it. A bark, clear and sharp, coming from the tree line. Rae's heart stopped. She stood perfectly still, listening, sure she'd imagined it. The wind moved through the pines, and somewhere a branch creaked. Then it came again, a single bark, deeper this time, more insistent. She took a step toward the sound, then another. Her hands were shaking. From the shadows beneath the trees, a dog emerged. He was thin, his coat rough and dusty, and his muzzle was grey with age. But his eyes were the same, dark and intelligent. And when he saw her, he stopped, his tail lowering uncertainly. Rae's knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. "Scout?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. The dog's ears pricked forward. He took a tentative step closer, then another. And then he was moving faster, crossing the clearing with the loping gait she remembered. He reached her and pressed his head against her chest, whining deep in his throat, and Rae wrapped her arms around him and started to cry. He smelled like wood smoke and pine and earth, and his ribs showed through his coat. But it was him. It was Scout. She ran her hands over his body, checking for injuries, feeling the familiar shape of his skull, the scar on his left shoulder from a training accident years ago. His tail was wagging now, beating against her legs, and he was licking her face and whining. "Where have you been?" she whispered, burying her face in his neck. "Where have you been, boy?" Scout pulled back and looked at her, then turned his head toward the woods. He barked once, sharp and urgent, then looked back at her. Rae wiped her eyes and tried to think clearly. Scout was alive. After 12 years, he was alive and standing in front of her. But how? How had he survived? And why had he come back now? She looked at him, more carefully in the fading light. He was old, 19 now if he'd lived this whole time, but he moved well, without the stiffness she'd expect in a dog that age. His coat was matted in places, but not filthy, and around his neck, tied loosely, was a faded red bandana. The same bandana he'd been wearing the day he disappeared. Rae touched it with trembling fingers. The fabric was soft with age and wear, but it had been retied recently. Someone had taken care of Scout. Someone had kept him alive all these years and sent him back to her. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. Scout pressed against her side, leaning into her the way he used to when he wanted reassurance. She looked toward the tree line where he'd emerged, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of who might be out there. Nothing. "Who brought you back?" she asked Scout, knowing he couldn't answer. "Who's been taking care of you?" Scout whined, again, and looked toward the woods. Then he walked a few steps in that direction, and stopped, looking back at her expectantly. Rae's mind was racing. She needed to get Scout inside, give him water, check him over properly. She needed to call Lloyd, tell him what had happened. She needed to understand how this was possible. But first, she needed to accept that it was real. Scout was here. Against all odds, against all logic, he had come back to her. She walked to the truck and pulled out a bottle of water, pouring some into an old bowl she found in the back. Scout drank eagerly, and she ran her hands over him again while he did, feeling his heartbeat, checking his teeth, looking at his eyes. He was in remarkably good shape for a dog his age, especially one who'd supposedly been lost in the wilderness for 12 years. Someone had definitely been caring for him. As the last light faded from the sky, Rae led Scout into the cabin. He sniffed around cautiously at first, then seemed to remember the place and went straight to his old bed in the corner. He circled it twice and lay down with a sigh, as if he'd just been out for a long walk and was glad to be home. Rae sat on the floor beside him, one hand resting on his side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. Outside, the first stars were appearing, and the mountain night settled in around the cabin. She had 1,000 questions and no answers, but for this moment, none of that mattered. Scout was home. Rae woke at dawn to find Scout standing by the door, waiting. She'd barely slept, too keyed up by his return, too overwhelmed by questions she couldn't answer. Every time she'd started to drift off, she'd reached out to touch him, needing the confirmation that he was real, that this wasn't some grief-induced hallucination. She got up and pulled on her boots, then opened the door. Scout stepped out onto the porch and stretched, his movements stiff but fluid enough. In the morning light she could see him more clearly. His coat had thinned in places, and there were small scars on his legs and flanks, the marks of a hard life lived outdoors. But his eyes were bright and alert, and when he looked at her, she saw the same intelligence and loyalty she remembered. She'd brought food with her, basic supplies for the week she'd planned to spend here. She filled a bowl with kibble and set it down, and Scout ate slowly, methodically, like he'd learned to ration. While he ate, Rae walked around the clearing, looking for signs of whoever had brought him back. The grass was tall and undisturbed, except where Scout had come through. No footprints, no tire tracks, no indication that another person had been here. After Scout finished eating, he walked to the edge of the clearing and paused, looking back at her. Then he barked once and started toward the tree line. "Hold on," Rae said, going back inside to grab her pack. She filled it with water, a first aid kit, rope, and her old trail map. Whatever was going on, she needed to understand it. If Scout wanted to show her something, she'd follow. They headed into the woods, Scout moving with purpose along a trail Rae didn't recognize at first. Then she realized it was one of the old game paths, barely visible now after years of disuse. Scout navigated it easily, occasionally looking back to make sure she was following. The forest was quiet, the air cool and sharp with the scent of pine. Rae's body remembered this terrain, even if her mind had tried to forget it. Her legs found their rhythm, her breathing settled into the pace of the climb. She'd spent so many years in these mountains that they'd become part of her, written into her muscles and bones. About half a mile in, Scout stopped beside a large ponderosa pine. He sat down and looked up, and Rae followed his gaze. Tied to a low branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze, was the red bandana. No, not the same one. Scout was still wearing his bandana. This was a second one, identical in color and pattern, tied deliberately where someone knew it would be found. Rae untied it and examined it carefully. The fabric was newer than the one around Scout's neck, less faded. Someone had left it here as a marker, a message. But what did it mean? She looked around the area more carefully. The ground near the tree showed signs of disturbance. Old disturbance, years old. She knelt down and brushed away pine needles, revealing scratches in the dirt. Scout whined and pawed at the ground beside her. Rae's ranger training kicked in. She pulled out her knife and carefully scraped away more debris, revealing what looked like the remains of a small cairn, rocks that had been stacked and then collapsed. Beneath them, she found a hand-carved wooden bowl, about 6 inches across, with unusual markings along the rim, geometric patterns that looked deliberate, purposeful. She sat back on her heels, turning the bowl over in her hands. Someone had made this, used it, left it here. The wood was smooth with age and handling, and the carving showed skill and patience. Scout nuzzled her arm, then stood and walked a few more yards along the trail. He stopped at another spot and began pawing at the ground. Rae followed and found more signs of human presence, a flat area where a tent might have been pitched, stones arranged in a circle for a fire pit, though no ash remained. She found fishing line wrapped around a stick, a snare made from wire, a piece of tarp folded and tucked beneath a rock. Someone had been camping here, and not recently. The evidence was old, weathered, but it was evidence nonetheless. She stood up and looked at Scout. "Who's been taking care of you, boy? Where have you been living?" Scout turned and continued along the trail, and Rae followed. They hiked for another hour, climbing higher into the mountains. The terrain became more rugged, the trail less defined. This was backcountry, the kind of wilderness where people rarely ventured. Rae had patrolled these areas during her ranger days, but even she hadn't covered every square mile. They came to a small stream, and Scout drank deeply. Rae refilled her water bottles and sat on a boulder, studying the landscape. From here, she could see the valley below, the town of Timber Ridge, barely visible in the distance. Up here, the world felt remote and timeless, a place where someone could disappear and never be found. Unless they wanted to be. The thought struck her with sudden clarity. Scout hadn't been lost. He'd been living with someone who'd chosen to hide in these mountains, and that someone had sent him back. But why now? Why after 12 years? Rae pulled out her satellite phone, one of the few modern concessions she'd made for this trip, and called Lloyd Hutchins. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Lloyd, it's Rae Lindstrom." There was a pause. "Rae? Good Lord, I heard you were back in town. How long's it been?" 12 years. Lloyd, I need to ask you something. Have there been any missing persons reports in this area? Anyone who disappeared into the mountains and never came back?" "Missing persons? Well, sure, over the years." "Why? Anyone in particular you remember? Maybe someone who went missing decades ago." Another pause. "There's the usual. Hikers who got lost, couple of suicides, folks who came up here to get away from something and never came back down. Why are you asking?" Rae looked at Scout, who was watching her intently. "Scout came back, Lloyd?" Silence. Then, "What do you mean, came back?" "I mean he walked out of the woods yesterday evening, alive and healthy. Someone's been taking care of him all these years." "Jesus, Rae. Are you sure it's him?" "I'm sure. He's got the same scar, same markings, same eyes. It's Scout. After 12 years, how is that possible?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. He's been living with someone up here, someone who's been hiding in the back country. I found camping sites, tools, a hand-carved bowl. This is deliberate, Lloyd. Whoever it is has been up here a long time." She heard papers rustling on Lloyd's end. "Give me a minute. I'm looking through old files. There was a guy back in the 80s, veteran who lost his family. House fire. He went missing after the funeral, and they never found a body. Folks assumed he killed himself somewhere in the mountains, but we never had confirmation." "What was his name?" "Tennant. Joseph Tennant. He was a Marine, served in Vietnam. Came back with PTSD, but he held it together for years. Had a wife and 2 kids. Then the fire happened. Faulty wiring. Burned the whole house down while he was at work. He buried his family and disappeared a week later. That was 1985. Rae did the math. 40 years ago. If Joseph Tennant had been in his 30s then, he'd be in his 70s now. Old, but not impossibly so. Do you have a description? Any photos? I'd have to dig into the archives. But I remember my predecessor talking about it. Said Tennant was a survival expert, knew the mountains better than anybody. If he wanted to disappear, he could. And no one ever found him. Searched for a couple weeks, but you know how it is up there. Million places to hide if you know what you're doing. Eventually they declared him legally dead. No family left to push for more. Rae looked around at the wilderness surrounding her. A man could live up here for 40 years if he had the skills and the will. The mountains would keep his secrets. Thanks, Lloyd. Can you send me whatever you have on Tennant? I can do that. Rae, be careful, all right? If someone's been living up there that long, they're not going to appreciate company. I know. I'll check in with you tonight. She ended the call and looked at Scout. Joseph Tennant. Is that who you've been with? Scout stood and shook himself, then started back along the trail. But instead of heading toward the cabin, he turned deeper into the mountains, toward the more remote areas Rae rarely patrolled, even in her working days. She hesitated, weighing her options. She could go back to the cabin, wait for Lloyd's information, approach this methodically and safely, or she could follow Scout and see where he led. The ranger in her knew the smart choice. But the woman who'd mourned this dog for 12 years couldn't turn back now. All right, boy, she said, shouldering her pack. Show me. They climbed higher, into terrain that was increasingly difficult. Rae's legs burned, and her breath came harder, reminding her that she was 61 and hadn't done this kind of hiking in years. But Scout was patient, stopping when she needed to rest, waiting while she caught her breath. In the early afternoon, they came to a rocky overhang that provided some shelter from the sun. Scout led her into the shade, and there Rae found more evidence, a lean-to shelter built from branches and tarp, a cache of supplies hidden in a natural hollow, and most significantly, a compass. It was old, military style, with a cracked face and a leather strap. When she turned it over, she saw initials carved into the back. J.T. Joseph Tennant. Rae sat down heavily, her mind racing. Scout had been living with Joseph Tennant, a man who'd disappeared 40 years ago after losing everything. A man who'd chosen the wilderness over whatever remained of civilization. And now Tennant had sent Scout back to her. The question was why. Scout lay down beside her, his head on her knee. She stroked his ears, thinking, if Tennant was still alive, he'd be old now, possibly ill. Maybe he couldn't take care of Scout anymore. Maybe he'd sent the dog back because he knew his own time was running out. Or maybe there was something else, some reason Rae couldn't yet see. She checked her phone for Lloyd's message. He'd sent a photo, scanned from an old newspaper article. The image was grainy, but she could make out a man in his 30s, dark-haired and serious, standing in uniform, Joseph Tennant, Marine Corps, before his life fell apart. Rae studied the photo, trying to imagine what 40 years in the wilderness would do to a person. The isolation, the grief, the daily struggle to survive. It would either destroy you or forge you into something entirely different. She looked at Scout. He saved you, didn't he? When the rock slide happened, he found you and saved your life. Scout's tail thumped once against the ground, and now he's sent you home because he can't take care of you anymore. Another thump. Rae stood up, her decision made. She needed to find Joseph Tennant, not to drag him back to civilization or report his location to the authorities, but to thank him, to understand what had happened to Scout and why he'd been returned now, and maybe, just maybe, to offer whatever help an old man alone in the wilderness might need. She packed the compass carefully in her bag, along with the wooden bowl, evidence, in case she needed it. Then she and Scout started back toward the cabin. She'd need more supplies for a longer expedition, better equipment, and a plan. Tomorrow, they'd go deeper into the mountains. Back at the cabin, Rae spread her old trail maps across the table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. The paper was yellowed and creased from years of use, marked with penciled notes from her ranger days. Good water sources, dangerous ravines, the locations of old mining camps and logging roads. She'd hiked every inch of these mountains, or so she'd thought. But looking at the maps now, she realized how much wilderness remained unexplored, vast tracts of backcountry where a person could live undetected for decades. Scout lay on his bed in the corner, watching her with those dark, intelligent eyes. Every so often he'd whine softly, as if urging her forward, telling her there was more to find. Rae traced possible routes with her finger, thinking about what she knew. The camping sites she'd found were roughly 3 miles from the cabin, trending northeast into higher elevation. If Joseph Tennant had been living up there for 40 years, he'd likely established a main camp somewhere with access to water, shelter from winter storms, and enough seclusion to avoid detection. The Bitterroot Wilderness offered all of that and more. There were box canyons and hidden valleys, caves worn into the limestone by ancient rivers, places where the forest grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. She'd found lost hikers in country like that, people who'd wandered 50 feet off the trail and become completely disoriented. But Tennant wasn't lost. He'd chosen to disappear, and he'd done it successfully for 4 decades. She pulled out her notebook and started making a list of supplies she'd need: food for several days, water purification tablets, a better first aid kit, emergency shelter. Her old backpack hung on a hook by the door, and she pulled it down, checking the seams and straps, still solid despite the years. As she worked, her mind drifted back to that last day with Scout, the day she'd replayed in her memory thousands of times. They'd been hiking a familiar trail, nothing technical, just a pleasant September afternoon in the mountains. Scout had been ranging ahead as usual, and she'd been thinking about retirement, about spending more time up here, about the quiet life she'd planned. Then the rock slide, the terrible sound of stone breaking free and tumbling down the mountainside. She'd called for Scout, but her voice had been swallowed by the roar. She'd tried to run, to reach him, but the ground had shifted, and she'd fallen. By the time she'd gotten back up, everything had changed. What she hadn't known, what she couldn't have known, was that Joseph Tennant had been there too, somewhere in those mountains, and he'd seen what happened. He'd found Scout injured and disoriented, and instead of bringing the dog out to search and rescue, he'd kept him. That should have made her angry. For 12 years she'd grieved, believing Scout was dead, and all that time he'd been alive, living with a man who'd had no right to keep him. But when Rae examined her feelings honestly, she found she couldn't summon real anger. Tennant had lost everything: his wife, his children, his entire life. If Scout had given him a reason to keep living, who was she to judge that? Still, she needed to understand. She needed to hear it from Tennant himself. Scout stood suddenly and walked to the door, his ears pricked forward. Rae listened, but heard nothing unusual, just wind in the trees and the distant call of a raven. Scout whined and scratched at the door. "You want to go back out there?" Rae said. It wasn't a question. Scout looked at her and barked once, sharp and clear. Rae checked her watch. It was mid-afternoon, plenty of daylight left. She could do some preliminary scouting, get a better sense of the terrain before committing to a longer expedition. She pulled on her boots and jacket, filled her pack with basics, and clipped a lead to Scout's collar, not because she didn't trust him, but because she wanted to keep him close. Then they headed back into the woods. This time, Scout led her on a different route, following a game trail that switchbacked up the mountainside. The climb was steep, and Rae had to stop several times to catch her breath. Her body wasn't what it used to be, and the years behind a desk in Kalispell had taken their toll. But her legs remembered the work, and after a while she found her rhythm. They climbed for an hour, gaining elevation steadily. The forest changed as they went higher, the ponderosa pines giving way to lodgepole and Douglas fir, the underbrush thinning out. Here the ground was carpeted with needles, and their footsteps made almost no sound. Scout stopped at a small clearing where a spring bubbled up from between two rocks, forming a tiny pool before trickling away downhill. He drank, and Rae knelt to refill her water bottle. The water was ice cold and tasted of stone and earth. While Scout rested, Rae looked around the clearing. This would be a good place for a camp. Water, relatively flat ground, good drainage. And there, at the edge of the tree line, she spotted something that made her heart beat faster. A fire pit, old but unmistakable. The stones were placed in a careful circle, and though no ash remained, the ground in the center was darker, stained by years of fires. She approached it slowly, her trained eye picking out other details. A flat rock positioned as a seat, a depression in the ground where a tent might have been pitched repeatedly. A length of rope tied between two trees at exactly the right height for hanging food away from bears. This had been a campsite, used regularly over a long period of time. Rae pulled out her camera and took photos, documenting everything. Then she walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for more clues. Near the spring, she found carving in the bark of an aspen tree. Not initials or graffiti, but careful marks that seemed to indicate direction. An arrow pointing northeast, and beneath it a series of notches. She counted them. 40 notches. 40 years. Scout watched her from the center of the clearing, his tail wagging slowly. He seemed pleased, as if he'd brought her to a place he wanted her to see. "You came here with him, didn't you?" Rae said softly. "This was one of your camps." She sat on the flat rock and tried to imagine it. Joseph Tennant sitting here after a day of fishing or foraging, Scout lying nearby, the two of them watching the sun set over the mountains. A companionship born of mutual need, a man and a dog keeping each other alive. How many nights had they spent here? How many fires had they built? How many meals had they shared? Scout would have been younger then, in his prime, and Tennant would have been, in his 60s. Still strong enough to live this hard life, but feeling the years. Rae stood and continued her survey of the clearing. At the far edge, partially hidden by brush, she found a cairn, a stack of flat stones about 2 feet high. It looked like a marker of some kind, though she couldn't tell what it marked. She didn't disturb it, just photographed it, and noted its location on her map. As she worked, the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Rae checked her watch. They'd been out for 3 hours, and the hike back would take at least 90 minutes. She needed to start down before it got dark. "Come on, boy," she said to Scout. "We'll come back tomorrow." But Scout didn't move. He stood at the edge of the clearing, looking northeast toward higher ground, and whined. "Not today," Rae said firmly. "It's getting late." Scout barked once, insistent, then took a few steps in that direction. Rae hesitated. Every instinct told her to head back, to be safe and sensible. But she could see the urgency in Scout's posture, the way he kept looking between her and the trail ahead. "What is it?" she asked. "What's up there?" Scout barked again, then started walking. After a few yards, he stopped and looked back, waiting. Rae made a decision. 30 minutes. We go for 30 minutes, and then we turn back no matter what. Understood? Scout's tail wagged, and he continued forward. They followed a narrow trail that wound between massive boulders and through stands of ancient timber. The going was slower here, more technical, and Rae had to use her hands in places to pull herself up steep sections. Scout navigated it easily, his mountain-born instincts guiding him. 20 minutes in, they came to a place where the trail seemed to disappear entirely, blocked by a wall of rock. Rae was about to call it quits when Scout squeezed through a gap between two boulders that she hadn't noticed. She followed, turning sideways to fit through the narrow opening, and emerged into a hidden draw, a small valley tucked between two ridges, invisible from any direction except this one. And there, built into the face of the cliff, was a shelter. It wasn't a cave exactly, more of a deep overhang that someone had improved with a wall of stacked stones across the opening. A tarp had been rigged as a door, tied back now to show the interior. From where she stood, Rae could see the shelter was empty, but it was clearly still in use. There were supplies stacked neatly against one wall, a sleeping platform built from logs and covered with pine boughs, and in the center, a ring of stones for a fire. Scout walked to the entrance and sat down, looking at her expectantly. Rae approached slowly, her heart pounding. She felt like an intruder, entering someone's home without permission. But she'd come this far, and she needed to understand. Inside, the shelter was surprisingly spacious, maybe 10 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The ceiling was natural rock, smoke-stained from years of fires. Someone had carved niches into the stone walls for storage, and in one of these niches, Rae found books, a Bible, some field guides to plants and animals, a collection of Hemingway stories with a cracked spine. On the sleeping platform, folded neatly, was a wool blanket. And beside it, propped against the wall, was a photograph in a weathered wooden frame. Rae picked it up carefully. The photo showed a young man in Marine Corps dress uniform, standing with his arm around a pretty woman in a blue dress. 2 children stood in front of them, a boy and a girl, both smiling at the camera. The man was Joseph Tennant. She recognized him from the newspaper photo Lloyd had sent. This must have been taken before the fire, before everything fell apart. She set the photograph down gently and continued looking around. There was a journal on one of the stone shelves, a thick notebook bound in leather. Rae hesitated, then opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise. Joseph Michael Tennant, January 1986. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or I've finally decided to come back. Either way, this is the record of why I left and how I survived. Rae closed the journal quickly, feeling like she'd violated something sacred. This was Tennant's private confession, his attempt to make sense of what he'd done. She had no right to read it without his permission. But lying on top of the journal was a single loose page, newer than the others, and the handwriting on it was shakier, less controlled. The date at the top was from 3 weeks ago. Against her better judgment, Rae read it. I'm dying. The cough has gotten worse, and there's blood now. I know what that means. I've lived up here for 40 years, and I don't regret it. But I can't take care of the dog anymore. His name is Scout, and he deserves better than to watch me waste away. I've taught him the route back to the cabin where I found him. His owner's name was Rae Lindstrom. She was a ranger. If she's still alive, if she's still in the area, Scout will find her. It's the last good thing I can do, give him back to someone who loved him. Maybe she can forgive me for keeping him all these years. Maybe not. Either way, It's time. Rae's hands were shaking as she set the page down. Tennant was dying, and he'd sent Scout back, not just because he couldn't care for him anymore, but as an act of restitution. He'd taken Scout 12 years ago and kept him, and now he was trying to make it right. She looked at Scout, who sat in the entrance of the shelter, watching her patiently. "He sent you home," she whispered. "He wanted you to find me." Scout's tail thumped against the stone floor. Rae stepped outside and looked around the hidden valley. The sun was touching the peaks now, and shadows were growing long. She needed to get back to the cabin before dark, but her mind was racing with questions. Where was Joseph Tennant now? Was he still alive, or had he gone off somewhere to die alone? The shelter looked unused recently. No fresh ash in the fire pit, no food scraps, nothing to indicate he'd been here in the past few days. But somewhere out in these mountains, a dying man was waiting. And Rae had to decide what to do about it. Rae made it back to the cabin just as the last light faded from the sky. Her legs ached, and she was breathing hard by the time she stumbled onto the porch. Scout seemed tireless, barely winded, and she remembered that he'd been living in these mountains for 12 years. This was his territory now, his home. Inside, she fed Scout and made herself a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the camp stove. While she ate, she thought about the journal entry she'd read. 3 weeks ago, Tennant had been sick enough to write what amounted to a farewell note. That meant he was either dead by now or very close to it. The humane thing would be to call. "Lloyd, get a rescue team up here. Bring Tennant out for medical treatment." But Rae knew in her gut that's not what Tennant wanted. He'd lived in the wilderness for 40 years by choice, and if he was dying, he'd want to do that on his own terms too. Still, she couldn't just leave him up there without at least making contact. She owed him that much for taking care of Scout. After dinner, Rae sat at the table with her maps and Tennant's journal page. She studied the handwriting, looking for clues. The shaky letters suggested weakness, but the words themselves were clear and rational. Tennant wasn't delirious or confused. He knew exactly what was happening to him. She pulled out her satellite phone and called Lloyd. "Find anything?" he asked. "More than I expected. I found Tennant's camp. He's been living in a shelter built into a cliff face, completely hidden." "And Lloyd, I found a journal entry. He's sick, maybe dying. He sent Scout back to me because he knew he couldn't take care of him anymore." Lloyd was quiet for a moment. "Jesus. After 40 years, he's still up there." "He is. Or was. I don't know if he's still alive, but I need to find him. Rae, if he's dying, he needs medical attention. We should get a team up there. And if he doesn't want that, Lloyd, he's spent 40 years choosing to be alone. If he's dying, maybe he wants to do that in peace. That's not our call to make." "Maybe not, but I'm going to find him first, talk to him, see what he wants. Then we can decide." She could hear Lloyd's frustration through the phone. "You always were stubborn as hell. All right, but you check in with me twice a day, understand? If I don't hear from you, I'm sending people up there." "Fair enough. I'll call you tomorrow morning." After she hung up, Rae sat for a long time just thinking. She'd spent 30 years as a search and rescue ranger, and the protocol was clear. You find someone in distress, you bring them out, you get them help. But Tennant wasn't a hiker who'd gotten lost or injured by accident. He was a man who'd made a conscious choice about how to live his life, and now he was making a choice about how to die. Did she have the right to interfere with that? She looked at Scout, who was lying on his bed with his chin on his paws, watching her. "What do you think, boy? What would he want?" Scout's ears twitched, but he didn't answer. Rae stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the night sky. Somewhere up there, Joseph Tennant was either dying or already dead, and she was the only person who knew about it. She thought about the photograph she'd seen in his shelter, the young Marine with his wife and children, all of them smiling, all of them gone now. Tennant had lost everything in one terrible moment, and instead of finding a way to keep living in the world, he'd retreated from it entirely. She understood that impulse. After Scout disappeared, she'd wanted to do the same thing. She'd transferred to a different mountain range, sold most of her belongings, cut ties with friends. It had taken her years to even begin functioning normally again. But she'd had her work. She'd had other people to save, other lives to focus on. Tennant had had nothing except these mountains, and eventually, Scout. Rae made her decision. Tomorrow, she'd go back up to the shelter and search for Tennant. She'd find him, talk to him if he was still alive, and honor whatever choice he'd made. And if he was already gone, she'd give him a proper burial up there in the mountains he'd chosen as his home. She went to bed but couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that photograph, those smiling faces of people long dead. She thought about grief and survival, about the different ways people responded to unbearable loss. Some people, like her, kept going through sheer force of will. Others, like Tennant, found they couldn't exist in the same world anymore. Neither choice was wrong. They were just different. At first light, Rae was up and packing. She filled her backpack with several days' worth of supplies: food, water, medical equipment, extra clothing. She packed the journal page carefully in a waterproof bag, along with the compass she'd found. Evidence, in case she needed it. Scout watched her preparations with interest, his tail wagging. He seemed to understand they were going back to the mountains, back to find Tennant. Before they left, Rae called Lloyd as promised. "Heading up now. I'll check in this evening. Be careful. And Rae, if you find him, if he's alive, at least give him the option of medical help." "I will, I promise." They set out just after sunrise, the morning air cool and crisp. Rae had studied her maps late into the night, trying to figure out where Tennant might have gone. The shelter was clearly a base camp, a place he returned to regularly, but the journal entry suggested he'd gone somewhere else to die. Somewhere meaningful. Somewhere final. She thought about what she knew of Tennant's story. He'd lost his family in a house fire in Timber Ridge. Maybe he'd want to die somewhere where he could see the town, the valley where he'd lived his former life. There was a ridge about 5 miles northeast of the shelter that offered a clear view of the Timber Ridge Valley. Rae had been up there once, years ago, and she remembered the vista, the entire valley spread out below, the town just a cluster of buildings in the distance. It would be a peaceful place to die. She pointed this out to Scout, showing him the location on her map, even though she knew he couldn't read it. "What do you think? Would he go there?" Scout sniffed the map, then looked up at her and barked once. "All right then. That's where we're headed." They made good time through the morning, stopping only for water and brief rests. Rae's legs protested the steep climbs, but she pushed through the discomfort. She was on a mission now, driven by the same sense of purpose that had sustained her through 30 years of rescue work. Around midday they reached the shelter again. Rae checked inside quickly, but nothing had changed, no sign that Tennant had returned. She refilled her water from the spring and continued on. The trail to the ridge was faint, barely visible in places, but Scout seemed to know where he was going. He'd been up here before, Rae realized. He and Tennant had made this hike together. As they climbed higher, the forest began to thin out. They were above the tree line now, moving through alpine meadows dotted with late-season wildflowers. The air was thinner here, and Rae had to stop more frequently to catch her breath. Scout was patient, never ranging too far ahead, always checking to make sure she was following. He'd learned this from his years with Tennant, Rae thought. This careful attention, this measured pace that accommodated an older, slower companion. In mid-afternoon, they reached a plateau that opened onto a stunning view. The entire Bitterroot Valley stretched out below them, the mountains rising on all sides like the walls of a great amphitheater. Rae could see Timber Ridge in the distance, tiny and insignificant from this height. And there, at the edge of the plateau, she saw something that made her heart clench. A simple shelter, built from dead wood and stones, just large enough for one person. And beside it, a wooden cross planted in the ground. Rae approached slowly. Scout pressed against her leg. The shelter was empty, but outside, carefully arranged on a flat rock, were Tennant's possessions, the journal she'd seen in the cave, the photograph of his family, a military dog tag on a chain, and a folded piece of paper with her name written on it. She picked up the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it. Rae Lindstrom, if you're reading this, it means Scout found you, and you cared enough to follow him back. Thank you for that. I know I had no right to keep him all these years. I found him after the rock slide, hurt but alive, and I told myself I was saving his life. Maybe I was, but the truth is, he saved mine. Without him, I would have died up here a long time ago. He gave me a reason to keep going, to keep living. I hope you can forgive me for the pain I caused you. I hope Scout gives you the same gift he gave me, a reason to keep going when everything else seems pointless. I'm at peace now. Please don't grieve for me. I made my choices, and I don't regret them. Tear. Rae folded the letter carefully and looked at the cross. It was handmade, the wood smoothed and fitted with obvious care, and carved into the crosspiece were the words, Joseph Michael Tennant, 1953, 22:25. Finally home. Scout sat down beside the cross and whined softly, his tail still. Oh boy, Rae whispered, kneeling beside him. He's gone, isn't he? Scout leaned against her, and she wrapped her arms around him. They sat there together, as the afternoon sun moved across the sky, two survivors mourning a man who'd chosen solitude over society, wilderness over comfort, and in the end had found his own kind of peace. Rae sat beside Joseph Tennant's marker for a long time, trying to process what she'd found. The man had prepared everything, his grave, his marker, his final message. He'd known exactly when and how he wanted to die, and he'd had the courage to see it through on his own terms. She looked around the plateau, trying to find where he'd actually gone. The shelter was empty, and there was no body nearby. Either he'd gone off somewhere more private to die, or... Her eyes fell on a narrow gap between two large boulders at the far edge of the plateau. Scout was looking in that direction too, his ears forward. Is that where he went? She asked softly. Scout stood and walked toward the gap, and Rae followed. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but once inside, it opened into a small cave, really more of a deep crevice in the rock. And there, laid out peacefully on a bed of pine boughs with his hands folded across his chest, was Joseph Tennant. He'd been dead for perhaps a week, Rae judged. The mountain cold had preserved him somewhat, but there was no mistaking that he was gone. He looked small and fragile, his face gaunt, his body wasted by illness. But there was something peaceful about him too, a sense of completion. Beside him were the few possessions he'd kept, a worn hunting knife, a fire starter, a canteen. The essentials. Nothing more. Rae backed out of the cave and sat down hard, her mind reeling. She'd found him. After tracking him through the mountains, following the clues he'd left, she'd found Joseph Tennant in his final resting place. Now she had to decide what to do. She pulled out her satellite phone and called Lloyd. When he answered, she said simply, "I found him. He's dead." Lloyd was quiet for a moment. "Where?" "On a plateau about 7 miles northeast of my cabin. He built his own grave marker, wrote final letters. He knew he was dying and he prepared for it." "Jesus, how long has he been dead?" "About a week, I'd guess. Lloyd, he wanted to die up here. He chose this place deliberately. We need to respect that. Rae, we have to bring him out. There are procedures, death certificates, all kinds of legal. I know, but give me a day. Let me do this right." She could hear Lloyd struggling with the decision. Finally, he said, "One day, but I'm documenting this conversation, and if anyone asks, I told you to wait for an official team." "Understood. Thank you." After she hung up, Rae sat with her back against the sun-warmed rock and thought about what Tennant would want. He'd spent 40 years hiding from the world, living on his own terms in these mountains, bringing his body out, subjecting it to autopsy and official documentation, putting his name in the newspapers. All of that would violate the life he'd chosen. But he was a Marine. He'd served his country, earned honors, survived war. He deserved to be remembered, even if only by a few people who understood what he'd been through. Rae made a decision. She would bury Joseph Tennant here, on this plateau with its view of the valley. She'd mark his grave properly and document it for the official record. But she wouldn't disturb his peace any more than necessary. She spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Using the small shovel she'd packed and Tennant's own tools, she dug a grave in a level spot near the cross he'd made. The ground was rocky and hard, and the work took hours. Scout lay nearby, watching, occasionally whining softly. As she worked, Rae thought about Tennant's life. He'd been a young Marine, probably full of dreams and plans. He'd married, had children, built a life. And then in one terrible night, it had all been taken from him. The fire had been an accident. Faulty wiring, Lloyd had said. Not anyone's fault, just random chance. But random chance could destroy a life as thoroughly as any deliberate act. Tennant had been left with nothing but grief and guilt. Why hadn't he died, too? Why had he been at work while his family burned? Those questions must have eaten at him, must have made every breath feel like a betrayal of the people he'd lost. So he'd gone to the mountains. He'd left behind the world where his family had died and created a new existence in a place where memory couldn't follow quite so easily. It wasn't healing exactly. Rae didn't think Tennant had ever healed from his loss, but it was survival, which was sometimes the best anyone could manage. When the grave was deep enough, Rae carefully moved Tennant's body from the cave. He was light, wasted by illness, and she laid him gently in the earth. She arranged his hands across his chest again and placed his dog tags around his neck. Then she stood at the edge of the grave and spoke. "Joseph Tennant, you were a Marine, a father, a husband. You loved deeply, and you lost everything, and you survived the only way you could. You lived with honor in these mountains, and you died with dignity. You saved Scout's life, and in doing so, you saved mine too. Rest easy now. Your war is over." She filled in the grave slowly, carefully, making sure the earth was packed firm. Then she placed the wooden cross at the head and arranged stones around the perimeter. It was simple, but it was respectful. A warrior's grave in a place of beauty. As the sun began to set, Rae sat beside the grave and opened Tennant's journal. She'd promised herself she wouldn't read it without permission, but Tennant was gone now, and the journal was the only way to understand his full story. The early entries were raw with grief. Tennant wrote about the fire, about identifying his wife and children's bodies, about the unbearable weight of being the only survivor. He wrote about his plans for suicide, the different ways he'd considered ending it. But then he wrote about walking into the mountains instead. Just walking, with no destination in mind, until he'd gone so far that turning back seemed more difficult than continuing forward. He wrote about learning to survive, teaching himself to hunt and fish, finding water sources, building shelter. The entries became less frequent after the first few years, more practical. Notes about the weather, about animal migrations, about which plants were edible. The journal of a man learning to live in harmony with wilderness. Then, 12 years ago, an entry that made Rae's breath catch. Found a dog today, badly hurt. German shepherd about 7 years old. He was caught in rock slide debris, his leg broken and several ribs cracked. He should be dead, but he's fighting to live. I know I should take him down to the ranger station, reunite him with his owner. But I can't make myself do it. I'm so tired of being alone. I'll set his leg, nurse him back to health, and then I'll decide. Maybe just a few weeks, maybe just until he's strong enough to survive on his own. The next entry was dated a month later. His name is Scout. I found it on his collar. He belongs to a ranger named Rae Lindstrom. I looked her up in old newspapers at the library in town. I hiked down at night, when no one would see me. She's well respected, decorated for her rescue work. She loved this dog. I know I should return him. But Scout saved my life. Having something to care for, something that depends on me, it's given me a reason to get up in the morning. I know this makes me a terrible person. I know I'm causing her pain, but I'm not strong enough to give him up. Not yet. Entries over the following years mentioned Scout regularly, teaching him to hunt, to fish, to navigate the mountains. Scout sleeping beside him during winter storms. Scout alert beside him when a bear came too close to camp. Scout's companionship making the loneliness bearable. And finally, 3 weeks ago, the entry Rae had already read. The one about dying, about sending Scout home, about trying to make amends. She closed the journal and looked at Scout, who was lying beside Tennant's grave, his head on his paws. He loved you, she said softly. Maybe not the way he loved his children, but in his own way, he loved you. And you loved him back. Scout's tail thumped once against the ground. Rae gathered Tennant's belongings, the journal, the photograph, the dog tags. She would give these to Lloyd for the official record, proof that Joseph Tennant had lived and died on his own terms. But she would also keep his secret about how long he'd kept Scout. That was between them, a private understanding between two people who'd both known devastating loss. As darkness fell, Rae set up her tent near the grave. She wasn't ready to leave yet. She wanted to spend one night here, keeping vigil, honoring the man who'd given Scout back to her. She built a small fire and cooked a simple meal, sharing bits of food with Scout. The stars came out, brilliant and countless in the mountain sky, and the night was quiet, except for the wind and the occasional call of an owl. Rae thought about Tennant spending 40 years up here, watching these same stars, listening to these same sounds. It must have been incredibly lonely, but there must have been moments of peace, too. Moments when the beauty of the wilderness made the pain bearable. She looked at Scout, who was watching her in the firelight. You gave him those moments, didn't you? You made it bearable. Scout moved closer and laid his head in her lap. "And now you've given me something too. You've given me a reason to come back to these mountains, to face the past instead of running from it. Thank you for that." They sat together in the darkness, two survivors bound by the memory of a man who'd chosen solitude over society, and in that choice had found his own form of redemption. Rae woke at dawn to find frost on her tent and Scout pressed against her sleeping bag for warmth. The mountain cold had come in during the night, a reminder that winter wasn't far off. She crawled out of her tent and stood, joints stiff, looking at Tennant's grave in the pale morning light. The wooden cross stood stark against the sky, a simple marker for a complicated life. Rae walked over and placed her hand on it, feeling the smooth wood Tennant had carved with such care. "I'm going to tell your story," she said quietly. "Not all of it. Some things should stay private. But people should know you were a good man who survived the best way you could." She made coffee on her camp stove and sat beside the fire, thinking about what came next. She needed to notify Lloyd officially, document the location for the record, and decide what to tell the authorities. Tennant had been declared legally dead decades ago, so there would be complications. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what Tennant had built up here. The shelter she'd found was clearly just one of several camps. He'd lived in these mountains for 40 years, and he must have established a network of sites, caches, routes. She pulled out the journal and flipped through it more carefully this time, looking for maps or descriptions of locations. Tennant had been methodical, noting landmarks and distances. Slowly, a picture emerged of his territory, a circuit of camps he'd rotated through seasonally, each one strategically placed near water and game. One entry in particular caught her attention. It was from about 15 years ago. Marked the final rest site today. "When my time comes, that's where I'll go. The view is perfect. I can see the whole valley, the town where I used to live. I can see the hill where Sarah and the kids are buried. It seems right to die where I can see them one last time, even if it's just their graves." So Tennant had planned this years in advance. He'd known exactly where he wanted to die, and he'd prepared for it with the same methodical care he'd brought to everything else in his mountain life. Rae looked at the plateau around her, the stunning vista of the valley below. From here, if she squinted, she could just make out the cemetery on the hill above Timber Ridge. Tennant had chosen this spot so he could be near his family in the only way he could, by being able to see where they rested. The weight of that realization settled on her chest. For 40 years, Tennant had been in exile, punishing himself for surviving when his family didn't. But even in his self-imposed isolation, he'd wanted to be close to them. Scout came and sat beside her, and she ran her hand over his head. "You understood, didn't you? You knew why he needed to stay up here?" Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from Lloyd. "Status update." Rae typed back. "Stayed overnight at the site. We'll call you in an hour." She needed to sort through her thoughts before talking to Lloyd. There were legal questions, procedural requirements, but there was also the question of what was right, what honored Tennant's choices while still fulfilling her obligations. She walked to the edge of the plateau and looked down at Timber Ridge. From up here, it looked peaceful, almost idyllic. The morning sun was just touching the rooftops, and she could see smoke rising from chimneys as people started their days. Tennant had been part of that community once. He'd had a house, a job, a life. And then one terrible night had taken it all away. Rae thought about the news stories that would have followed. The tragedy, the funeral, the grieving widower. And then, a week later, when Tennant disappeared, the speculation. Had he killed himself? Run away? People would have talked, would have wondered, would have eventually moved on. But Tennant hadn't moved on. He'd just moved up, into these mountains, and built a different kind of life. She walked back to camp and started packing her gear. She'd give Lloyd the coordinates, show him the journal, explain what she'd found. But she'd also make a request, that Tennant be left here, that his grave remain undisturbed, that his story be told with respect for the choices he'd made. Before she left, she took photographs of everything: the grave, the cross, the plateau, the view. Documentation for the official record, but also for herself. She wanted to remember this place, this man, this moment of understanding. Scout watched her preparations, and when she shouldered her pack, he stood too. But instead of heading back the way they'd come, he walked to the far side of the plateau and looked at her expectantly. "What is it, boy? Something else you want to show me?" Scout barked once and started down a trail Rae hadn't noticed before. It was narrow and steep, cutting down the far side of the ridge. Rae hesitated. She needed to get back, call Lloyd, start the official process. But Scout was insistent, and she'd learned to trust his instincts. All right, but just for a little while. They descended carefully, Scout leading the way with confidence. After about 20 minutes, they came to a small meadow tucked into a fold in the mountain. And there, arranged in a careful circle, were 3 small cairns. Rae approached them slowly. Each cairn was about 3 feet high, built from carefully selected stones. And on top of each one, protected by a flat rock, was a photograph. She lifted the first rock and looked at the photograph beneath. It showed a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, smiling at the camera. On the back, in faded ink, "Sarah, my heart." The second photograph showed a boy, maybe 8 years old, with a gap-toothed grin. "Michael, my son." The third showed a girl, younger, with pigtails and a serious expression. "Emma, my daughter." Rae's throat tightened. Tennant had built a memorial for his family up here, a private place where he could come and remember them. The photographs had been protected from the weather, carefully preserved for decades. She sat down among the cairns, overwhelmed by the depth of Tennant's grief. He'd carried these photographs into the wilderness, had taken the time and effort to build these monuments, had visited this place regularly to maintain it. This was the heart of his exile. This meadow, these stones, these images of the people he'd lost. Scout lay down in the center of the circle, as if he'd been here many times before. Rae realized he probably had. This must have been one of Tennant's regular stops, a place he'd come to talk to his family, to remember, to grieve. She looked at the photographs again, at the smiling faces frozen in time. Sarah, Michael, Emma. They'd died in 1985, more than 40 years ago. If they'd lived, Sarah would be in her 70s now. Michael and Emma would be middle-aged, might have families of their own. But they hadn't lived, and Joseph Tennant had spent the rest of his life unable to move past that single terrible night. Rae understood that now, in a way she hadn't before. She'd lost Scout for 12 years, and it had nearly broken her. Tennant had lost his entire world, everyone he loved, and he simply couldn't function in the same reality anymore. So he'd created a new one, up here in the mountains, where he could live with his grief without having to pretend to be all right, without having to move on or heal or any of the other things people expected. She carefully replaced the photographs under their protective rocks and stood. This memorial wasn't for her to document or disturb. It was Tennant's private shrine, and it should remain that way. "Come on, Scout," she said quietly. "Let's go home." They climbed back up to the plateau, and Rae took one last look at Tennant's grave. She felt like she understood him now. This man who'd saved Scout, and in doing so, had given her back something precious. The hike back to the cabin took most of the day. Rae's legs were tired, and she had to stop, frequently to rest. But Scout stayed close, matching his pace to hers, and they made steady progress. By late afternoon, they emerged from the tree line, and the cabin came into view. Rae had never been so glad to see it. She dropped her pack on the porch and sat down heavily, Scout flopping beside her. Her phone had signal here, and she called Lloyd. "I was about to send a team up there," he said when he answered. "Sorry, it took longer than I expected. Lloyd, I need to talk to you in person. Can you come up to the cabin tomorrow?" "That's serious?" "I found Tennant, and I buried him. There's a lot to explain." Lloyd was quiet for a moment. "All right. I'll drive up first thing in the morning. Rae, are you okay?" "I will be. This is complicated." After she hung up, Rae sat, watching the sunset, paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Scout leaned against her leg, warm and solid, and she rested her hand on his head. "We found him," she said softly. "We found him, and now we understand. That's something, isn't it?" Scout's tail thumped against the porch boards. Rae thought about the journey she'd been on since Scout had reappeared 3 days ago. She'd been planning to sell this place, to close this chapter of her life, and move on. But now everything had changed. She understood now that some losses never fully heal. Tennant had lived with his grief for 40 years, and she'd lived with hers for 12. But understanding that grief, honoring it, giving it space, maybe that was a kind of healing, too. She wasn't ready to leave the mountains anymore. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Lloyd arrived at the cabin just after sunrise, driving his county sheriff's truck up the rutted road. Rae had coffee ready, and they sat on the porch while she told him everything, finding Tennant's camps, the journal entries, the grave on the plateau, the memorial meadow. Lloyd listened without interrupting, his face grave. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. 40 years, he finally said. The man lived up there for 40 years, and nobody knew. He was a Marine, trained in survival, and he was motivated. After losing his family like that. Rae shook her head. "I think staying up there was the only way he could survive." "And the dog? Scout?" This was the part Rae had been dreading. She took a breath and told him about the rock slide, about Tennant finding Scout injured, about the journal entries where he'd wrestled with the decision to keep him. "So he knew Scout belonged to you, and he kept him anyway?" "Yes, for 12 years. Lloyd rubbed his face. "That's Jesus, Rae. That's not a small thing. You grieved for that dog. You transferred to another district because you couldn't work these mountains anymore." "I know. And you're not angry about it?" Rae looked at Scout, who was lying in a patch of sunlight, watching them. "I was, at first. But Lloyd, Tennant saved Scout's life. The rock slide would have killed him if Tennant hadn't found him. And Scout saved Tennant's life too, in a different way. He gave him a reason to keep living. That doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it understandable." Lloyd stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the mountains. "We need to document this properly. Death certificate, burial location, cause of death. There'll be questions about why you didn't bring the body out." "I know. But Lloyd, he wanted to die up there. He prepared for it, chose the location, built his own marker. Bringing him out, putting him through an autopsy, making his death public, it would violate everything he'd chosen for the last 40 years. I get that, but I've got procedures to follow. Then follow them. Document everything. But let me make one request. Leave him buried up there. Let that plateau be his final resting place. Lloyd turned to look at her. You know the county's not going to like that. I know, but it's the right thing to do. They spent the next hour going through Tennant's journal, with Rae showing Lloyd the relevant entries. Lloyd photographed pages, took notes, documented everything with the methodical care of a good law enforcement officer. When he got to the entries about Scout, he paused. You sure you want this in the official record? People might not understand. They don't have to. Tennant's dead, and I've got Scout back. The rest is between us. Lloyd nodded slowly. All right. I'll write it up as... What? A found death? Elderly man living off-grid who died of natural causes? That's accurate, isn't it? More or less. Lloyd closed the journal and handed it back to her. Keep this safe. It's evidence, but it's also... Hell, I don't know what it is. A testament, maybe. To survival, Rae said. To finding a way to keep living when everything says you should just give up. After Lloyd left, promising to handle the paperwork and keep Tennant's story as private as possible, Rae sat with the journal in her lap. There was one more section she hadn't read yet, entries from the final weeks of Tennant's life. She opened to a page dated a month ago. The cough is worse. I know what it means. I've seen enough men die to recognize the signs. Lung cancer, probably, from all those years of campfire smoke and mountain air mixed with God knows what. I'm not afraid. I've lived longer than I had any right to, longer than Sarah and the kids got. But I'm worried about Scout. He's old now, too, slowing down, and he deserves better than to watch me waste away. I've been thinking about the ranger, about Rae Lindstrom. I've watched her over the years, you know. Not in a creepy way, just checking from a distance, making sure she was all right. She retired 5 years ago, left these mountains, but I've kept track. She's alone, like me. No family that I can see. Maybe she and Scout can save each other the way he and I did. Rae's hands tightened on the journal. Tennant had been watching her? For years? She read on. I hiked down to Timber Ridge last week, at night when no one would see me. First time I've been back in almost 40 years. The town's changed some, but not as much as I expected. I found her old cabin, the one where Scout went missing. It's still there, falling apart, but standing. I left Scout's old collar tied to the porch, a signal in case she ever comes back. Then I started teaching Scout the route from my camp to her cabin. It took a few tries, but he remembered. Smart dog. He always was. Rae felt something cold settle in her stomach. The collar. She'd seen it when she first arrived, hadn't she? Tied to the porch railing, so faded she'd barely noticed it. She went inside and looked. Sure enough, hanging from a nail on the porch post, was a cracked leather collar. She'd seen it and assumed it was one of Scout's old collars she'd left behind. But looking at it now, she realized it was in better condition than anything that had been here for 12 years. Tennant had left it. A message, a promise. Scout is coming back to you. She returned to the journal, her heart pounding. 3 weeks now since I sent Scout down. I watched him go, watched him hesitate at the edge of the tree line. But then he kept going, following the route I taught him. I hope she's there. I hope she takes him in and gives him the life he deserves. As for me, I'm headed to the plateau tomorrow. Time to face what's coming. I'm not afraid. I'll be with Sarah and the kids soon, in whatever comes after this. And I'll be able to see their graves one last time. That's enough. The entry ended there, but tucked between the pages was a folded piece of paper Rae hadn't seen before. She opened it carefully. It was a letter addressed to her, but different from the one she'd found at the grave. The handwriting was shakier, the words harder to read. Rae, I know this doesn't make up for what I did. I know keeping Scout all these years was wrong, but I was drowning, and he was the only thing keeping my head above water. I watched you over the years, watched you struggle with his loss, and every time I told myself I'd bring him back, but I was too selfish, too broken. So I'm doing it now, at the end, and I'm hoping it's not too late. There's something else you should know. The rock slide that day. It wasn't random. I saw it coming. I saw the cracks in the cliff face earlier that morning, and I should have reported it. But I didn't because I was hiding, avoiding people, and I told myself it would probably be fine. Then you and Scout came along that trail, and I watched it happen. I watched the rocks fall, and I could have warned you, but I was too far away, and my voice wouldn't carry. By the time I got there, you were hurt, and Scout was trapped in the debris. I pulled him out, set his leg, kept him alive. But the guilt of not preventing it, that's eaten at me ever since. I caused your loss by my silence, and then I made it worse by keeping him. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Maybe Scout can help you heal the way he helped me. Maybe that's the only redemption I can offer. Rae read the letter 3 times, each word sinking in like a stone. Tennant had seen the rock slide coming. He could have warned her, could have prevented Scout's injury, but he'd been hiding and hadn't acted fast enough. The twist recontextualized everything. This wasn't just a story of a hermit finding a lost dog and keeping it. This was about guilt and responsibility and the terrible weight of choices not made. Tennant hadn't just saved Scout. He'd felt responsible for Scout being injured in the first place. Keeping the dog all those years had been partly survival, partly companionship, but also partly penance. He'd been trying to make up for his failure to prevent the rock slide by taking care of Scout as perfectly as he could. And now, in his final act, he'd sent Scout back to make amends. Rae walked outside and sat on the porch steps, the letter still in her hands. Scout came and sat beside her, pressing his weight against her leg. He felt responsible for losing you, she said quietly. All these years, he carried that guilt on top of everything else. She thought about Tennant's life, the fire that killed his family, the rock slide he failed to prevent, the dog he kept instead of returning. Layer after layer of guilt and grief, each one adding to the burden. But he'd survived it. He'd found a way to keep living, day after day, year after year, in those lonely mountains. And he'd taken care of Scout with what must have been extraordinary dedication and love. The anger she might have felt was complicated now by understanding. Yes, Tennant should have returned Scout. Yes, his silence about the rock slide had consequences. But he'd paid for those failures with 40 years of isolation and self-imposed exile. And in the end, he'd tried to make it right. Scout whined and licked her hand, and Rae realized she was crying, not from anger or grief exactly, but from the sheer weight of understanding. Life was so much more complicated than right and wrong, good and bad. It was full of impossible choices and consequences that rippled out for years. Tennant had made mistakes. So had she, transferring away instead of staying to keep searching, giving up too soon, letting grief consume her. But they'd both survived, and they'd both found their way to this moment, this strange and painful resolution. She looked at Scout, really looked at him. He was 19 years old, far older than most German shepherds lived. He should have died in that rock slide, or in the years after, alone in the wilderness. but he'd survived because Joseph Tennant had saved him, had cared for him, had given him 12 extra years of life. "He loved you," Rae whispered, "and you loved him. That's what matters." Scout leaned harder against her, and they sat together in the morning sun, two survivors bound together by a complex web of loss, guilt, love, and redemption. The mountains rose around them, silent witnesses to everything that had happened, and Rae understood that some stories couldn't be simplified into neat moral lessons. Some stories were just about people doing the best they could with impossible situations and finding grace where they could. Tennant had found it in Scout's companionship. Scout had found it in having two people who loved him. And Rae was starting to understand that she'd found it too in this strange journey back to the mountains and the truth about what had really happened 12 years ago. For 3 days after Lloyd left, Rae stayed at the cabin, processing everything she'd learned. She read and reread Tennant's journal, trying to understand the full scope of his 40-year exile. The man had been methodical, documenting everything: seasonal migration patterns of game, locations of edible plants, weather patterns, the slow changes in the forest around him. But woven through the practical entries were glimpses of his inner life. Moments of crushing loneliness, memories of his family that would surface without warning, and increasingly, as the years went on, entries about Scout. "Scout caught a rabbit today. He's getting good at this. Better than me, actually. Watched him stalk it for 20 minutes before he pounced. Reminded me of Michael, how patient he could be when he was working on something. Scout has Michael's focus, Emma's gentleness. Sometimes I think he was sent to me for a reason. 12 years since I found him. He's slowing down now, grey around the muzzle, stiff in the mornings. I know what's coming. I'm not ready to lose him. After Sarah and the kids, I swore I'd never let myself care about anything again. But Scout, he snuck past my defenses. I love this dog. God help me. I love him. Scout saved my life today, literally. I was crossing a stream on rocks I've used 100 times, and I slipped, hit my head, woke up on the bank with Scout standing over me, whining. He must have dragged me out. I owe him everything. The entries painted a picture of profound attachment, the kind of bond that forms between two beings who have only each other. Rae understood it, because she'd had that same bond with Scout in the years before the rock slide. On the 4th day, she woke with a sense of purpose. She knew what she needed to do. She called Lloyd. I'm going back up to the plateau. I want to maintain Tennant's grave, make sure it's properly marked. Rae, you don't have to do that. The county has accepted my report. As far as the official record goes, this is closed. I know, but I want to. He gave Scout back to me. The least I can do is make sure his resting place is cared for. Lloyd was quiet for a moment. You're planning to stay up there, aren't you? In the cabin? I don't know yet. Maybe. What happened to selling the place and moving on? Things changed. Yeah, Lloyd said softly. I guess they did. Rae spent the morning preparing for the hike. She packed tools for grave maintenance, seeds for wildflowers to plant around the marker, and a permanent bronze plaque she'd ordered from a supplier in Missoula. It bore a simple inscription: Joseph Michael Tennant, USMC. 1953 or 2025. He found peace here. Scout watched her preparations with interest, his tail wagging. He knew where they were going. Before they left, Rae walked through the cabin one more time. She'd spent the past few days cleaning it, repairing what she could, making it livable again. The roof still needed work, and the porch steps were still dangerous, but it was starting to feel like home again. She looked at her search and rescue badge, still sitting on the dresser where she'd left it weeks ago. She picked it up and studied it. Rae Lindstrom, Senior Ranger. That had been her identity for 30 years, and then she'd lost it along with Scout. But maybe she could build something new here. Not rescue work, exactly. She was too old for that kind of physical labor. But mentoring, teaching, helping the next generation of rangers learn the mountains, sharing the knowledge she'd spent decades accumulating. And maybe, in a strange way, continuing Tennant's legacy. He'd been a teacher too, in his own way, teaching Scout to survive in the wilderness, teaching himself to live with unbearable loss. She put the badge in her pocket and headed outside. The hike up to the plateau took most of the day. Ray's pace was slower than before, and she had to rest frequently. But Scout was patient, waiting whenever she needed to stop, never ranging too far ahead. As they climbed, Rae thought about the conversation she'd had with Gwen Mackay 2 days ago. She'd driven down to Timber Ridge to pick up supplies, and Gwen had invited her to sit for coffee. "Heard you found something up in those mountains," Gwen had said carefully. Lloyd wouldn't say what, but he looked troubled. Rae had considered how much to share. Gwen had lived in Timber Ridge her whole life. She would have known Joseph Tennant, would have remembered the fire and his disappearance. "I found Joseph Tennant," Rae had said finally. "He's been living up there since 1985. Gwen had gone very still. "Joe Tennant? He's alive?" He was. He died a few weeks ago. Natural causes. Gwen had set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. My God. All these years, we thought. Most people assumed he'd killed himself somewhere in the mountains. He survived, built a life up there, alone. Why didn't he come back? We would have helped him, supported him. The whole town mourned with him when Sarah and the kids died. "I think that was the problem," Rae had said gently. He couldn't bear the sympathy, the looks, the constant reminder of what he'd lost. Up in the mountains, he could grieve on his own terms. Gwen had been quiet for a long time. Then she'd said, "That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard." Yes, but it was his choice. Now, climbing toward Tennant's grave, Rae thought about loneliness and choice. Tennant had chosen isolation over community, wilderness over civilization. It wasn't a choice most people would make, but it had worked for him. He'd survived 40 years that way. She wondered if she was making a similar choice, deciding to stay in the cabin instead of returning to Kalispell. But it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like coming home. They reached the plateau in late afternoon. Tennant's grave was undisturbed, the wooden cross still standing straight. Rae set down her pack and stood for a moment, looking at the marker. "I brought you something," she said aloud, feeling slightly foolish, but also like Tennant deserved to be addressed directly. "Something more permanent." She unpacked the bronze plaque and her tools. The ground was rocky, but she managed to secure a post and mount the plaque beside the wooden cross. It gleamed in the afternoon sun, official and respectful. Then she cleared the area around the grave, pulling weeds and arranging stones more carefully. She scattered wildflower seeds, mountain bluebells, Indian paintbrush, alpine forget-me-nots. Come spring, the grave would be surrounded by color. As she worked, she talked. She told Tennant about Lloyd's visit, about the official report, about the decision to leave him buried here. She told him about her plan to stay in the cabin, to make a life in these mountains again. "Scout's doing well," she said. "He's slowing down, but he's happy. I think he misses you. Sometimes he looks toward the trees, like he's expecting you to walk out. But he's adjusting." Scout, lying nearby, lifted his head at the sound of his name. "I want you to know I forgive you," Rae continued, "for keeping him, for not preventing the rock slide, for all of it. You did what you needed to survive, and you gave Scout a good life. That's more than a lot of people manage. The wind picked up, moving through the sparse trees at the edge of the plateau, and Rae could almost imagine it was Tennant's response. An acknowledgement, maybe. Or just the mountain, indifferent to human drama. She finished her work as the sun began to set. The grave looked good, respectful and permanent. Tennant would rest here with a view of the valley, watching over the town where his family was buried, and that seemed right. Rae set up her tent and built a small fire. She'd brought food for Scout and herself, and they ate together as darkness fell. The stars came out, brilliant in the clear mountain air, and Rae felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. This was where she was meant to be. Not running from the past, but understanding it, accepting it, finding a way to live with it. Scout curled up beside her, and she rested her hand on his side, feeling his heartbeat. He was old now, 19, and she knew she wouldn't have him much longer. But she had him now, and that was enough. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to Scout or to Tennant or to the mountains themselves. "Thank you for bringing him back." The fire burned low, and Rae added another piece of wood. She thought about tomorrow, about hiking back to the cabin, about starting the repairs in earnest, about reaching out to the search and rescue headquarters to see if they needed volunteers for training programs. She thought about building a life that honored both Scout's return and Tennant's memory, a life that acknowledged loss, but didn't let it be the only story. The mountains rose around her, dark shapes against the star-filled sky, and Rae felt held by them, protected. Home. She'd spent 12 years believing Scout was gone forever, and 5 years after that, drifting without purpose. But now, sitting beside his grave, she understood that the journey hadn't been wasted. She'd needed those years to be ready for this moment, this understanding, this strange and painful grace. Scout sighed in his sleep, and Rae smiled. Tomorrow they'd go home. Tomorrow they'd start building something new. But tonight she'd sit vigil at Joseph Tennant's grave and honor the man who'd saved Scout's life, and, in doing so, had given her own life back. Rae woke before dawn to find Scout standing at the edge of the plateau, looking out over the valley. She crawled out of her sleeping bag and joined him, wrapping her jacket around her shoulders against the cold. The valley below was still dark, but the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. They stood together in silence, watching the slow arrival of day. "You're saying goodbye, aren't you?" Rae said softly. "This is your last time up here." Scout looked up at her, and in his dark eyes she saw understanding. He knew. Dogs always knew. As the sun broke over the distant peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rae felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about Scout saying goodbye to Tennant. It was about both of them saying goodbye to the life they might have had if the rock slide had never happened. If Tennant had reported the cracking cliff. If Scout had never been injured. If Rae had never lost him. There were 1,000 different paths their lives could have taken, but they'd taken this one, and now they had to make peace with it. "I forgive him," Rae said again, meaning it more deeply this time. "And I forgive myself for not finding you sooner. We all did the best we could." Scout leaned against her leg, warm and solid, and they watched the sun rise together. After breaking camp, Rae knelt one last time beside Tennant's grave. She placed her hand on the bronze plaque, feeling the engraved letters beneath her fingers. "Rest easy, Joseph. Your war is over." Then she stood, shouldered her pack, and started down the mountain with Scout at her side. The descent took hours. Ray's knees ached with every step, reminding her that she wasn't young anymore, that the mountains demanded respect, regardless of how much experience you had. But Scout moved ahead of her with surprising energy, as if the visit to the plateau had renewed something in him. They stopped at the shelter where Tennant had lived, and Rae took a final look around. The space felt empty now, haunted. She'd already taken the journal and the photograph, the important things. Everything else could stay as Tennant's monument to a life lived on his own terms. As they continued down, Ray's mind wandered to practical matters. The cabin needed work, serious work. The roof, the porch, the well. She'd need to hire help, probably from town. That meant interacting with people, becoming part of the community again. The thought didn't frighten her the way it might have a few weeks ago. She was ready to rejoin the world, or at least her small corner of it. They reached the cabin in late afternoon. Ray's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and she nearly fell climbing the porch steps. Inside, she collapsed onto the couch, and Scout lay down on his bed with a heavy sigh. For a long time they just rested, too tired to do anything else. Eventually, Rae forced herself up and made dinner. She fed Scout first, then heated soup for herself. As she ate, she looked around the cabin with new eyes. This wasn't just a place she was visiting anymore. It was home. She thought about calling Lloyd, updating him, but decided it could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she just wanted to sit with Scout and be grateful for this strange, complicated gift she'd been given. But Scout didn't settle. He ate his dinner, drank water, then went to the door and whined. "You need to go out?" Rae asked, standing stiffly. She opened the door, expecting Scout to step onto the porch. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing and looked back at her, barking once. "Scout, it's getting dark. We just got back." But Scout barked again, more insistent, and started toward the tree line. Ray's heart sank. She was exhausted, her body aching from the long hike. But Scout was clearly trying to show her something, and after everything he'd led her to, she couldn't ignore him now. She grabbed a flashlight and her jacket and followed him into the woods. Scout led her along a path she hadn't taken before, moving with purpose despite his age. The light was fading fast, and Rae had to use her flashlight to navigate the rough terrain. After about 20 minutes, they came to a small clearing she didn't recognize, and there, arranged in a neat pile, were Scout's things from his years with Tennant. A worn water bowl, a rope toy, frayed but well used, a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and dog, and most significantly, a collar, not the one Scout was wearing, but a newer one with a metal tag attached. Rae picked up the tag and held it in her flashlight beam. It was hand-stamped, the letters uneven but clear. Scout. If found, return to Rae Lindstrom. Bitterroot Mountains. Her throat tightened. Tennant had made this. Years ago, probably, preparing for the possibility that something might happen to him, and Scout would need to find his way home. She looked at Scout, who was watching her intently. "He made sure you could come back to me. Even years ago, he was planning for it." Scout's tail wagged slowly. Rae gathered the items, Scout's treasures from his life with Tennant. She would take them back to the cabin, keep them safe. They were part of Scout's history, part of the complicated story of survival and loss and love that had brought them all to this moment. As they walked back through the darkening forest, Rae thought about legacy. Tennant had left behind no children, no traditional markers of a life well lived. But he'd left Scout, and he'd left these carefully prepared gifts, and he'd left his journal documenting 40 years of survival against impossible odds. That was a legacy. Maybe not the one he'd imagined as a young Marine starting a family, but a legacy nonetheless. Back at the cabin, Rae arranged Scout's things in the corner beside his bed. The rope toy, the bowl, the blanket. Scout sniffed them, then curled up on his bed with the blanket pulled close. Rae sat on the floor beside him, running her hand over his greying muzzle. You had a good life with him, didn't you? Even though it wasn't the life you were supposed to have. Scout's tail thumped once against the floor. And now you're here with me, and we'll make the most of whatever time we have left. That's all anyone can do, right? Make the most of the time we're given. She thought about Tennant's final years, sick and dying, but still taking care of Scout, still making plans to ensure the dog would be all right after he was gone. That kind of love, selfless and practical and enduring, was rare. And she'd been the beneficiary of it, even though she hadn't known it at the time. Rae stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains. Somewhere up there, Tennant rested in his carefully chosen grave. Come spring, wildflowers would bloom around his marker, and hikers who stumbled across the plateau might wonder about the man buried there. Or maybe no one would find it. Maybe it would remain hidden, known only to her and Scout and the mountains themselves. Either way, Joseph Tennant had found his peace. And now, finally, so had she. The next morning, Rae woke with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She made coffee and sat on the porch with Scout, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and she knew exactly what she needed to do. She called Lloyd first. I'm staying, the cabin, the land, I'm keeping it all. Figured you might, Lloyd said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. What changed your mind? I don't think it changed. I think it was always going to end up this way. I just needed to understand why. And do you understand why? Rae looked at Scout, who was lying in a patch of sunlight. Yeah, I do. This is where I'm supposed to be. After hanging up with Lloyd, she made a list. The cabin repairs would take priority. She couldn't stay here through winter without a sound roof and functioning well. She'd need to hire help, order materials, and that meant money. She'd have to look at her retirement savings, maybe sell some stocks. But it was worth it. This wasn't just about having a place to live. It was about honoring what had happened here, about creating something meaningful from loss. Over the next week, Rae threw herself into the work. She hired a contractor from Timber Ridge, a young guy named Ryan, who didn't ask too many questions about why she was fixing up a cabin that had been abandoned for 12 years. They replaced the roof, repaired the porch, got the well working again. Gwen stopped by one afternoon with a casserole and stayed for coffee. They sat on the newly repaired porch, and Gwen said, "Town's talking, you know, about you being back, about whatever you found up in those mountains." "Let them talk," Rae said. "Lloyd won't say much, just that you found Joe Tennant's remains, and he's been officially declared dead. But people are curious." Rae considered how much to share. Joseph Tennant spent 40 years living in these mountains because he couldn't bear to be in the world after losing his family. He survived through skill and determination, and he died on his own terms. That's all anyone needs to know. Gwen nodded slowly. Fair enough. But Rae, if you ever want to talk about it, really talk about it, I'm here. I know. Thank you. After Gwen left, Rae sat with Scout and thought about community. For so long, she'd pushed people away, convinced that isolation was easier than connection. But Tennant's story had shown her the cost of that isolation. 40 years alone was a heavy price to pay, even if it was freely chosen. She didn't have to make the same choice. That evening, Lloyd called. "Got something for you. I've been going through the county archives, and I found Joseph Tennant's military records. Thought you might want to see them. Can you send them?" "Better. I'll bring them up tomorrow. I've been meaning to see what you've done with the place anyway." When Lloyd arrived the next day, he brought a manila folder thick with documents. They sat at the kitchen table while Rae went through them. Tennant's service record was impressive. 2 tours in Vietnam, multiple commendations, an honorable discharge, letters from commanding officers praising his leadership and tactical skills, and photographs, a young Tennant in uniform, serious and focused, before the war and loss had marked him. He was a good man, Lloyd said quietly. Before everything happened, before the fire, everyone in town liked Joe Tennant. He coached a little league, volunteered at the fire station. He was the kind of guy you wanted in your community. Rae looked at the photographs, trying to reconcile the young Marine with the hermit who'd lived in the mountains for 40 years. Both were Joseph Tennant, but they seemed like different people entirely. "Trauma changes us," she said. "Sometimes it breaks us so completely that we have to become someone else just to survive." "Is that what happened to you?" Lloyd asked gently. "When you lost Scout?" Rae considered the question. "Maybe. I ran away, transferred to a different mountain range, tried to become someone who'd never loved a dog that much. But it didn't work. You can't run from that kind of loss. You can only learn to carry it. And now? Now I'm learning to carry it differently. Scout came back, but he's not the same dog he was. And I'm not the same person. We're both older, both marked by what we went through. But we're here, together. And that's enough." Lloyd stood to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Staying here, honoring Tennant's memory. It takes courage to face the past instead of running from it." After he left, Rae sat with Tennant's military records spread across the table. She thought about putting together a proper memorial, maybe donating his medals to the local VFW, making sure his service was remembered even if his life after the war remained mostly private. She looked at Scout, who was sleeping peacefully on his bed. 19 years old, living on borrowed time, but content. Happy even. "We're going to be all right," she told him softly. "Both of us. We're going to be all right." And for the first time in 12 years, she believed it. 3 months had passed since Scout had walked out of the woods and back into Rae's life. Winter had settled over the Bitterroot Mountains, and snow covered the ground in a thick blanket that made everything clean and quiet. The cabin was warm now, properly winterized with a new roof and functioning heating system. Rae had made it comfortable, filling it with the small touches that turned a structure into a home. Books on the shelves, photographs on the walls, Scout's bed positioned in the corner where the afternoon sun pooled. She'd hung 2 photographs side by side above the fireplace. One showed Joseph Tennant as a young Marine with his family, all of them smiling. The other was new, Rae and Scout on the cabin porch, both of them a little grey, a little worn, but alive and together. Interconnected stories of loss and renewal, displayed where she would see them every day. Scout moved more slowly now. The journey to Tennant's grave had taken something out of him, some final reservoir of strength. He slept more, ate less, and on cold mornings his joints were stiff, but his eyes were still bright, and his tail still wagged when Rae came into the room. She knew they were approaching the end. She'd been a ranger long enough to recognize the signs, but she wasn't afraid anymore. They'd been given this time together, this unexpected grace, and she was grateful for every day. She'd started volunteering with the search and rescue training program, teaching young rangers how to read terrain, track lost hikers, survive in extreme conditions. The work felt good, purposeful. She was passing on knowledge she'd spent decades accumulating, ensuring it wouldn't die with her. and she'd found ways to honor Tennant's memory, too. She'd donated his medals to the VFW, where they were displayed with a plaque explaining his service. She'd made sure the county records reflected his death with dignity and respect. And she'd started maintaining the trail to his grave, clearing it each season so that it remained accessible. Not that many people knew about it. She'd told only Lloyd and Gwen the full story, and they'd kept it private. Tennant had chosen isolation in life. She would honor that in death. On a bright January morning, Rae sat on the porch with Scout, both of them bundled against the cold. The valley below was stunning, covered in snow that sparkled in the sunlight. "I've been thinking," she said to Scout, who was lying with his head on her lap, "about legacy, about what we leave behind. Tennant didn't have children or a traditional life, but he left something important. He taught me about survival, about finding ways to keep living even when everything says you should give up." Scout's tail moved slightly, acknowledging her voice. "And you're part of that legacy too. You connected us, gave both of us a reason to keep going. That matters. That's worth something." A truck came up the road, and Rae recognized it as Lloyd's. He'd gotten into the habit of stopping by once a week, checking on her, sharing news from town. It was the kind of quiet friendship she'd always valued, but had forgotten how to maintain. Lloyd climbed out and joined her on the porch, accepting the coffee she poured from her thermos. "How's he doing?" Lloyd asked, nodding at Scout. "Slowing down. But happy, I think. And you?" "Same, slowing down, but happy." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the mountains. Finally, Lloyd said, "You know, people in town have been asking about you, wondering if you'd be interested in serving on the County Search and Rescue Advisory Board. We could use someone with your experience." Rae considered it. A few months ago, she would have said no automatically, unwilling to commit to anything that tied her to one place or community. But now, "I'll think about it," she said. Lloyd smiled. "That's more than I expected. By the way, I stopped by the cemetery yesterday. Put flowers on the Tennant family graves. Figured Joe would have wanted someone to do that." Rae felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. That was kind. Seemed right. They were good people who had something terrible happen to them. And Joe, he carried that weight for 40 years. Least we can do is make sure they're not forgotten." After Lloyd left, Rae sat with Scout and thought about memory and forgetting. The world moved on. People died. Stories faded. But some things endured if someone cared enough to keep them alive. She would keep Tennant's story alive, in her own way. Not by making him famous or turning his tragedy into a lesson, but by remembering him as a complete person, flawed, broken, but ultimately brave in his own fashion. And she would keep Scout's story alive too. The dog who'd been lost and found, who'd lived 2 lives and connected 2 broken people. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Rae helped Scout stand, and they walked slowly around the clearing. Scout's steps were careful, measured, but he seemed to enjoy the movement. They made a circuit of the property, checking the new trail markers Rae had placed, looking at the bird feeders she'd hung from the trees. When they returned to the porch, Scout climbed carefully onto his bed, and Rae sat beside him, her hand resting on his side. They watched the sunset together, the sky turning brilliant shades of orange and purple. "We did good, didn't we?" Rae said softly. "You and me and Tennant, we all did the best we could with what we were given. That has to count for something." Scout sighed, a deep, contented sound, and closed his eyes. Rae stayed there beside him as the light faded, grateful for this moment, this day, this unexpected gift of time. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, The loss, the grief, the years apart, and finally the strange and painful reconciliation. She thought about Joseph Tennant, resting on his mountain plateau, finally at peace. She thought about Scout, who'd lived an extraordinary life by any measure, loved by two people who'd needed him desperately. And she thought about herself, learning to live again after years of just existing, learning that it was never too late to come home, to forgive, to begin again. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, witnesses to human drama, but untouched by it. Rae had spent her whole life in these mountains, and now she would spend the rest of her days here, carrying the stories of the people who'd passed through, honoring the connections that mattered. Scout's breathing was deep and even, peaceful in sleep. Rae stayed beside him, keeping watch, grateful for every breath, every moment. The future was uncertain. It always was. But the present was enough. The cabin, the mountains, Scout beside her, the memory of a hermit who'd saved them both. It was enough. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rae whispered, "Thank you. For everything. For coming back, for leading me to him, for showing me the way home." And in the silence of the mountain night, surrounded by the wilderness that had shaped her life, Rae Lindstrom finally found her peace.